what's up, YouTube fans? So, what I wanted to talk about in this video, right, is how whales, right, are a great example for showing that the tetrapod, the features shared across the tetrapod group, right, did not actually have to be that way for any practical reason, any efficiency reason, and they're best predicted by the nested hierarchical patterns, right, which go well beyond practicality, efficiency, with very precise predictive power. So tetrapods are a large clade, including the amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, right? And there are many classic examples of homology in the tetrapods, right? With the limb pattern, for example, right? There's a limb pattern shared by all tetrapods that still have their limbs, which we do not see in other groups aside from the tetrapods, right? Even other groups that have separately evolved legs, right? And we see that it's the same pattern regardless of what the limbs are used for functionally, right? That's an important point, that it goes beyond practicality, efficiency. It goes beyond that because it's the same pattern regardless of how it's used, right? Some use it for flying, some for swimming, some for climbing, some for walking. It's the limbs are used for many different purposes, and even between different groups that use the limbs for the same purpose, we see differences in which parts of the limbs are used for which part of the function, right? Different parts are assigned different parts of the function, even for creatures that use their limbs in the same way, even though it's the same fundamental pattern across tetrapod limbs, right? So, like, for example, amongst creatures that use their limbs for walking, some use them, some are digitigrade, meaning they walk on their toes. Others are plantigrade, like us, meaning we walk on our full foot, not just our toes, right? Some are unguligrade, meaning they walk on their hooves, and so none of the rest of their foot actually touches the ground, right? But so in creatures that are digitigrade, right, like dogs, cats, birds, the only part of their limbs that are functioning how our feet function is the toes, right? The rest of their foot is functioning more like what the rest of our leg functions like, right? And in some of these groups, the rest of their foot is even very thin compared to their toes, right? In the case of birds, right, we see the rest of the foot is very thinned out. It looks more just like it's a part of their, it looks more though as though, it looks as if like that their leg is bending backwards, right? When really that's their feet, right? And so, and yet it's the same fundamental parts, which is why it's considered that they're walking on their toes, is because we know from the bones that it's the same bones as it is in our toes, right? But so in any event, while all of that is true, what would also be true and a fair point to some extent is that while there are many traits shared across the tetrapod group, right, most of these traits, right, are they were specifically evolved in early tetrapods because they were adapting to life on land. And so because most tetrapods live at least partially on land, um, for, for the most part, it makes practical sense that they would all share these traits, right? But what blows that out of the water, right? Uh, no pun intended, what blows that out of the water is whales, right? We see whales, they live fully in the water, right? They spend their whole lives in the water, and yet still having most of these tetrapod traits, right? So among them, the limbs, right? Like I said, that these limbs are used so different functionally between different tetrapods. Even the whales, which they use their limbs more like how a fish uses its fins, right? And yet they still share the same fundamental structure, right? With a humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, digits with phalanges, the same pattern, right? They also have cervical, sacral, and coccygeal vertebrae, right? And also whales have eyelids that blink, right? So it makes sense that tetrapods evolved eyelids that blink since they were going on land. And so it makes sense then that that will be a trait shared across that tetrapod group. But it's best predicted by the nested hierarchical patterns. It isn't predicted based on practicality. When it comes to the whales, they spend their whole life in the water, right? And even when they go to the surface to get air, they don't have to take their eyes out of the water. Their blowhole is on top of their head. They never actually even have to take their eyes out of the water, right? And yet they still have eyelids that blink. A feature that almost no fish has, right? Also tongues. That's another tetrapod feature that is not shared with fish. They have muscular, highly mobile tongues, right? We see that in whales, right? Also, lacking gills and instead having lungs, right? Unlike fish, right, which have gills and almost, most of them do not have lungs, right? And yet in the case of whales, they have trachea, bronchi, lungs, no gills, right? Even though they spend their whole life in the water, right? Also, unlike most fish, they have a middle ear with 3 middle ear bones, right? With Malleus, Incus, Stapes. That's predicted by the fact that they're mammals, right? Also, as amniotes, right? They have amniotic eggs. That's not something we see in any fish, right? No fish has amniotic eggs. And they are warm-blooded, right? No fish is warm-blooded. And so even though they spend their entire life in the water, they still have all of these many tetrapod traits that most fish do not have, right? And so then that shows that practical reasons like spending time on land, right? That does not actually predict whether or not something would have the traits of a tetrapod. It is best predicted based on the nested hierarchical patterns, right? Which go beyond practicality, go beyond efficiency, go beyond all of that. And also, interestingly, with the blowhole of whales, right? Just as we would expect if it originally started as nostrils, more like is typical in vertebrates, right? And then was modified such that it became a blowhole up above the eyes, much as we would expect if that was the case, we see that during embryonic development, the whale's nasal passage starts out at a spot more like that of other mammals, right? At the tip of the snout or rostrum, right? And then it further into development, it migrates up to the position that it has when they are born, right? Um, and so that is much as we would expect if they originally had a more typical nasal passage, which was then modified as they evolved over time. It's actually also interesting. That specific evolutionary transition has been brought up a few times to me by creationists, where they would say oh, how could you ever have like an evolutionary change where you go from like a more typical nasal passage setup to the setup that whales have? It just seems like so like unbelievable that you could have a change like that. How could you ever change from one form to the next? But okay, the change morphologically, it's done over every time they develop embryologically, right? It's done over every time it's played out again, right? The morphological aspect of it, right? Um, and so, that's all for now. See you guys.